high-tech tanks, rare plant enthusiasts. Maybe you just seek a challenge. This episode of Fertilizer 101 is for you. We're going to talk about powdered fertilizers and the estimated index method. Stay tuned. Hello everyone, this is Bentley, and we're going to continue Fertilizer 101. We've talked about the basics, we've talked about micro and macronutrients, plant deficiencies, we've talked about the two main all-in-one methods of delivery, liquid and root tabs. Now it's time to talk about the granddaddy of them all, the most complicated method, but also the most cost-efficient method, and that's powdered fertilizers. Now, when we talk powdered fertilizers, we're usually thinking cans like this, maybe a bag like this. They come from a lot of different manufacturers. For instance, these are Greenleaf Aquarium stuff. This is Nylock G. Again, much like all the other fertilizers, there are a lot of places that will produce powdered fertilizers for you. And typically, they're all individual. Like, this is one specific nutrient. This is one specific nutrient. This is one specific nutrient. This is a part of the estimated index method of fertilizer dosing. And while up front it seems extremely complicated and might initially seem kind of expensive to get into, kind of like adding pressurized CO2 to a tank, in the long run it's actually really easy, and more importantly, it's extremely cost efficient. So, let's dive a little deeper on this stuff and explain why you would start looking toward doing the estimated index method, and more importantly, what the heck is it? So first, let's do a primer on what the estimated index method of fertilizer dosing is. Basically put, we are going to dose macros on day 1, micros on day 2, macros on day 3, micros on day 4. Are we noticing a pattern here? Macros on day 5, micros on day 6, and on our 7th day, we water change. Now, the reason why we do this, in powdered form without those stabilizers, things like your iron can get consumed by things like phosphate. This is the most common interaction. There are a few other small interactions where a macronutrient can mess with a micronutrient, but the most common is that phosphate will mess with iron and prevent iron from being absorbed into the water system, into the plants. It basically just eats the iron and destroys it. There's a more complicated way to explain this, but we're going to skip that part. We don't need to go that deep. So, by spreading it out day by day and alternating our nutrients, it makes sure that it keeps it safe and we're getting a full dose of each of the nutrients into the water column each day. Now, for those who are like me, this is a little complicated because now we need to dose every single day. We need to alternate and pay attention to what we're doing. And more importantly, because we're getting them in those tins or bags or however you're buying your nutrients, typically they're not pre-mixed. So you need to go and buy every individual one and make your own mixture up based on the size of your tank. Now, lots of the places that sell you a powdered fertilizer of some form or another are going to have a recommended dosing instruction. The problem is it's recommended, and that's not how your tank is going to absorb it. My water, for example, has nothing in it. It's super light, so I probably need to use some things that you might not necessarily need to. An example would be like that bag of fertilizers is calcium sulfate. There's no calcium in my water. There's no hardness whatsoever. And for most things to keep stable, you need kind of a nutrient like that. Usually we would add just crushed coral to put calcium in the water out here in Seattle, but some people might want to mineralize their water specifically through how they dose their fertilizers. Or maybe you have very calcium-hungry plants like a big carpet of beautiful Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo loves calcium, so you're going to need to dose a little extra. This is an example of where the estimated index method gets really complicated. You have to pay attention to your plants, your plant load, how much CO2 you're pushing, all that kind of stuff. But if you really want to turn it into expert mode and go for some really crazy plants or some extremely color vibrant, you're trying to push the absolute perfect color out of every plant in your tank, Estimated Index is probably where you want to start looking. Now, the reason why seventh day we water change is the goal at the very end of each Estimated Index cycle is we're going to remove excess nutrients that are in the water system. Typically, this is done with a 50% water change, sometimes more, but 50% is the recommended for Estimated Index. Then we let the system calm down for a day, and we start again. The big thing here is that you're going to be doing all these little mixtures. So let's talk about the pros and cons of the Estimated Index and powdered fertilizer, and we'll determine whether or not it's right for you. The first major pro is that this stuff will last a long time. When you buy a bag of powdered fertilizer like this, or a big tin, you're using your doses like a teaspoon or a quarter teaspoon. And if you're using small tanks, like something that's 20 gallons or less, you're using somewhere between, at most, an eighth of a teaspoon per dose. Well, there's a lot of eighth of a teaspoons in this bag. And if you're doing something that only needs like a 32nd of a teaspoon or a 64th, which a lot of those measurements will require, this is going to last you a super long time. Now, the problem with Estimated Index and the con to this, and we're going to kind of bounce back and forth because I think it's a little more impressive. The con is kind of similar to what I showed you earlier. You're going to start ending up like this and more and more and more and more. And eventually you're going to be like me, where if you decided you were going to buy some of this stuff and try it out here soon, you end up with an entire drawer full of bags and tins of white powdery substances. Now, come to think of it, I'm going to look like I'm trying to smuggle something wrong somewhere else, aren't I? That might be a problem. As you can imagine, because you're buying a ton of these things, and each thing is going to cost you between $25 and sometimes $50 per tin, it will seem extremely expensive up front. However, because each of these tins lasts you so long, and you can completely custom mix your nutrients, that $50 is going to last you a very long time per nutrient. So in the end, long term, you will spend significantly less buying powdered fertilizers than you would buying a liquid all-in-one or even root tabs. The upfront cost is a little higher, but the long-term cost is significantly lower. And more importantly, because we get to dial everything in, we can get the absolute perfect nutrient balance for each of our planted tanks and make sure that they are at their optimal nutrition to give our plants the best growth, color, everything. Also, when you run into plant deficiencies, it's so much easier in the Estimated Index method to dose just the one thing you need more of, unless you buy a premix blend or you're mixing your own blends. There are some places that will sell your macros and your micros in pre-done mixes. The benefit here is that they're pretty simple. However, you need to check and look at the balance of how they're mixed, because the recommendations for how you mix things change based on the number of gallons of water in your tank. And then again, they also change based on your plant density. So sometimes those pre-mixes actually are less effective than buying each individual thing and mixing it yourself. Now, this is a little less common with the trace minerals, so your micros. It matters more on your macros. Your micros can kind of all go about the same blend, and your micros are going to last you the absolute longest. It's in your macros where you're really best suited by custom blending them to exactly what your tank needs. Maybe you have a really, really dense plant structure, or some very fast-growing, lots and lots of fast-growing plants. Not just a couple, but like most of your stems. You're doing a big like stem display in this beautiful aquascape. You probably need a lot more nitrogen than the basic suggested in the Estimated Index. So instead of, say, an eighth of a teaspoon, maybe you need a quarter teaspoon in your dose mixture in order to make sure there's enough nitrogen for each of those plants. The next major con, aside from cost, and you're going to end up with a drawer full of tins that might look really suspicious if you ever try to take them on an airplane, is that this requires a lot of careful mixing. and time. And if you do decide to mix them into a liquid solution, which is typically suggested rather than putting just raw powder into your tank, that powder and that liquid solution you create only lasts for so long before it would go bad. So what we want to do is be able to make only so much as we're going to use in between 2 weeks to a month. And if we make more than that, it's kind of a waste and you basically need to throw it out. So if you're not careful in understanding how much you need and how much to dose, you can end up having a lot of waste. Now, the pro side of this is that you can get it to however you want to dose. Maybe you want to make your solution kind of nutrient dense so that each milliliter represents 10, 20, 30 gallons of water. That might be a little extreme. I would probably do something a little more simple, but you can make it so it's easy to dose based on whatever you have. And more importantly, you could go to a place like Amazon or whatever and get your own custom pump head bottles and mix it perfectly so that, like, all right, two fluid ounces comes out of this thing, or 2 milliliters, whatever comes out of the pump head. Usually it's like milliliters, and it's typically 2. I know that every pump is going to treat 20 gallons. And it's perfectly balanced for my tank. I just go through, boom, 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 done. And you make it kind of like an all-in-one. You just have to take the time to mix all of those things up yourself. And typically, you can mix all of your macros together and all of your micros together. You just can't blend the two. So once you've figured out exactly what your perfect mixture is, that golden solution, now you can mix everything together every time you mix a batch up. Mix it into a bottle with a pump head, bam, you have your own all-in-one fertilizer, and it's a lot cheaper. The downside, you gotta figure all that stuff out, and that takes a bit of time, and can be one heck of a hassle if you're lazy, or more importantly, if you don't have the right tools. This is going to require you buying some extra tools, some very specific measuring spoons, or you're gonna measure by weight. It gets complicated. So if you're a beginner, I wouldn't look at the estimated index method. More importantly, if you don't think you have the time, I wouldn't look at the estimated index method. But if you want to do a super high-tech tank, lots of CO2, really powerful lighting, maybe you got the UNS Titan lights, and I'm pushing tons and tons of CO2, super high CO2. I'm going to dedicate myself to rare plants and all this stuff that is very hard to grow. Now you're talking in the realm where you really want to have a custom mixture and really, really careful so you can monitor everything you want. And powder fertilizer is probably going to be the way to go if you're that deeply invested in your planted tank. So that's kind of the pros and cons. It's really simple. An estimated index method, while it sounds complicated at first, once you start doing it, you're going to actually realize it's really simple. And it gets you in an important habit. Smaller doses of fertilizer every day. I often will talk about this with all-in-ones, where I think it is actually better for us to dose every day in a small amount than it is to do a couple doses of a big amount, because it gives the plants a continuous source and continuous capability to grow off of all those nutrients. And in the end, typically, it can cause less algae long-term. Now, if you do this wrong, you can cause a ton of algae because there will be too much in excess. But again, much like powdered fertilizer, this is a part of figuring everything out, dialing it in, and getting it perfect for your water, your light, and your situation. I have long said that I personally do not do the estimated index method. However, several of the people who I often communicate with when I'm talking about plants do. And I'm going to be honest with you, it's something that I want to long-term test. It's why I have a bunch of this stuff. I have literally over there an entire drawer full of stuff that I bought at a local club auction off of a friend. And it's complicated, but I think at the same time, if we were doing a really, really nice display tank, let's say the Guppy tank behind me, the Guppy Mansion, I wanted to go a little more high-tech. I wanted to push higher levels of CO2. I wasn't going to do the Bentley low and slow method. I wanted to push a good amount of CO2, really good nutrients, and I'm going to aerate the heck out of this thing so it's safe for the guppies, and I want lots of high-tech tanks. I'm going to put tons of lighting on this thing. Then I'm going to start looking at the powdered fertilizer because I really want to dial everything in and get it perfect. If you really want to pursue some of the very hard plants out there, let me give you some examples like Rotala, Ramiosaur Florida, Ludwigia Tornado. Some of these are like harder plants that tend to need high amounts of CO2, very strong light, and very good fertilization. And you're typically in a really nice aqua soil or something like that. You're probably going to want to start looking at estimated index because you really need to dial that fertilizer in there and have a continuous source of food for some of those plants because of the amount of demand that they have. If you're not using CO2, I would almost never look at the estimated index method because I think your plants don't have the level of demand necessary to warrant dosing every single day unless you were to dose in an extremely diluted fashion and make your nutrients go extremely far. There is one alternative, though, and while I personally haven't messed with it, Greg Sage of Select Aquatics sells a powdered fertilizer that is an all-in-one blend that makes it very cheap to buy, and you would dose it just like you would something like, say, Thrive, Easy Green, Dustin's Grow Juice, Seachem Flourish, any of those liquid all-in-one fertilizers. But it starts as a powder, which makes it cheap. So if you're looking at maybe kind of tiptoeing into powdered fertilizers, that might be your option. If the sole goal is just to make your fertilizer cost less, this is also probably a good route to take a look at. Again, I want to stress, I personally have not tried Greg's stuff, so I can't speak to how good it is or how long it lasts or if it's going to work with XYZ setup. But it is an option, and I kind of want to just put it out there because I've had a few questions about it in the previous videos in this series. That's it, guys. That is your basics for the estimated index method and powdered fertilizer. So what I'd really love to know down in the comments, have any of you tried estimated index, bought powdered fertilizers? Maybe you've tried Greg Sage's fertilizer. Let me know down below. Hit the like button if you've enjoyed this stuff, if you've really been enjoying this series especially. Maybe even give it a share. That really helps with those magic YouTube algorithms. If you don't enjoy learning about fertilizer and you think that I clearly didn't explain the estimated index method with enough robust depth and science, you can hit the thumbs down twice. I'll understand. If you're new to this channel, maybe consider giving a subscribe, maybe even ring that little bell so you can get caught up on everything in this series. The previous ones are going to be up in the corner. It's a great playlist. I think it's full of tons of information. The feedback so far has been really positive. If you enjoy all this stuff, maybe you want to see even just a teeny tiny bit more, consider becoming a member. You get access to a members-only Discord at nearly every level, and more importantly, a few behind-the-scenes things in the members-only content. It's small stuff. Don't expect, like, a video like this will never be in there, but there's some cool stuff that gives you some insight into the stuff I'm working on so that when the full video comes out, you'll know, like, hey, I saw that. I knew it was coming. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome. Really hope you guys enjoyed this video. I've really been getting a kick out of this series. It's been a real blast to interact with you in the comments. You guys have really been enjoying this, so thank you so much. I want to make a big shout out to a couple of the folks on the both Patreon and member side who kind of hit that extra mile, the rainbow fish category, and that's Cody and Ginger Graves. Your names are coming up. I appreciate you guys so much. I kind of can't help like the bag of white stuff joke. Because eventually when you end up like a drawer for a fertilizer, I mean, like mine has like mason jars and all sorts of stuff. It's nutty when you kind of dive into the estimated index method, how deep you end up going because there's so many little things that you can dose. And yeah, it's complicated. But eventually we're going to put this stuff to use and we're going to put this through a proper testing lab and look at the difference between estimated index, liquid all-in-one, and root tabs very, very thoroughly. Again, if you watched this video this far and you've enjoyed this stuff, maybe consider becoming a member or heading over to my Patreon. You get access to several things, members-only content, and at certain tiers, all sorts of other bonuses like a members-only Discord, which I hope to see you there. It's a really good way to just get in touch with me, ask questions, maybe even suggest a video in the future. I can't stress enough, like, no one needs to be a member. The best way to help the channel is just to like, to comment, to share, all those kind of things. Those help the channel so much. But if you decide to go that extra mile, understand that I truly appreciate it. It gives me an opportunity to buy white powdery substances so that I can test them and give you guys feedback and let you know how good they really are. Stay awesome, guys.